Welcome to the New Books Network.
Welcome to New Books in Environmental Studies, a podcast channel on the New Books Network. Thank you for joining us today. I'm your host, Ahmed Al-Mazmi, a PhD candidate at Princeton University. Today I'm here to talk to Dr. Emmanuel Kreike, the author of Scorched Earth, Environmental Warfare as a Crime Against Humanity and Nature, published by Princeton University Press just this year, 2021. Dr. Emmanuel Kreike is a professor of history at Princeton University. He holds a PhD in African history from Yale University, and he's also a doctor of science in tropical forestry from the School of Environmental Sciences at Wageningen University. I hope I'm saying it right, in the Netherlands. His research and teaching interests focus on the intersection of war, population displacement, the environment, and society. He has published a number of books, including Recreating Eden, Land Use, Environment, and Society in Southern Angola and Northern Namibia. Also, Deforestation and Reforestation in Namibia, the Global Consequences of Local Contradictions, and Environmental Infrastructure and African History, Examining the Myth of Natural Resources Management in Namibia, published by Cambridge University Press in 2013, and also edited a volume with Chester Jordan titled Corrupted Histories, published by Rochester University Press in 2004, among many other publications. Today's book, Scorched Earth, Environmental Warfare as a Crime Against Humanity and Nature, is a rich exposition. And through talking about the book, we will explore how the environmental infrastructure that sustains human societies has been a target and instrument of war for centuries, resulting in famine and disease, displaced populations, and the devastation of people's livelihood and ways of life. Scorched Earth traces the history of scorched earth, military inundations, and armies living off the land from the 16th to the 20th century. The book argues that the resulting deliberate destruction of the environment, which Professor Kreike dubs as envirocide, constitutes total war and is a crime against humanity and nature. And this sweeping global history, Kreike shows how religious war in Europe transformed Holland into a desolate swamp where hunger and the Black Death ruled. He describes how Spanish conquistadors exploited the irrigation works and expansive agricultural tracts of the Aztecs and Incas, triggering a humanitarian crisis of catastrophic proportions. Kreike demonstrates how environmental warfare has continued unabated into the modern era. His panoramic narrative takes readers from the 30 Years' War to the wars of France's Sun King, and from the Dutch colonial wars in North America and Indonesia to the early 20th century colonial conquest of southwestern Africa. The book sheds light on the premodern origins and the lasting consequences of total war. It explains why ecocide and genocide are not separate phenomena and why international law must recognize environmental warfare as a violation of human rights. Thank you, Professor Emmanuel Kreike, for joining New Books in Environmental Studies.
Well, thank you, Ahmed El-Mazmi, for giving me this opportunity to discuss the book with you.
The pleasure is ours. We would like first to learn about the author. If you can share with us a few words about yourself, where you grew up, where you went to school, how did you shift from forestry to history, and how you became interested in the questions that this book actually poses.
Well, I'm a native of Holland and still a citizen of Holland. So I studied history there. I was always interested in history, but I was also very interested in environmental affairs, environmental issues. I had the fortunate fortune that when I grew up, right, I lived in a small Dutch town, but every summer I went to stay with my grandparents who lived in a small rural town all the way in the west of the Netherlands, several hours away. As you know, Holland is a very big country. Um, and they had their own garden. They grew their own food. They had, my grandmother had a brother who was a farmer, so we went to the farm also once a week. And I was very interested in that kind of things, and also in the war. Right, the Netherlands was affected by World War II, so my grandparents, my parents, they all had experienced the war and the dislocation and displacement that had caused. And so that was also always an interest of mine. And in this book, right, one of my sort of spatial interests, geographical interest was Africa for various reasons, right? I once took a course at another university, not my own university, and there was an American historian who talked about African history. And he actually brought all these things together for me because he talked about how in Africa, right, this was a lecture on sort of the underdevelopment of Africa. And in his lecture, he sort of, what he argued is that why is development in Africa not working? And he said because they're not really directing information and education at the right people. So he gave this example in his lecture of agricultural development, where he said, well, all the extension workers and all the information and reports and subsidies for farming and information, they're all directed towards the men. But he said in the area where I worked, and that was more general the case in Africa, it's actually women who do most of the agriculture. And that's sort of, I thought that's really fascinating, right? How society and environment and agriculture interact. So that really stimulated me, and he actually encouraged and helped me get a scholarship in the U.S. where I studied African history. And while I was preparing to do my PhD research in Africa, I decided to to spend some time in Wageningen, which is an agricultural university in the Netherlands. To understand better sort of the environment and agriculture in Africa. And that's also where my sort of forestry, environmental background and agricultural background and training comes from. And I try to apply that during my research in Africa most of my research was based on interviews with villagers and farmers in a in a border area between Angola and Namibia, very small villages. So that's where I started doing this research, and then I came across this was an area right north of Namibia, south Angola. This was an area which turned out to be during my research. I became aware that there was also the major actually war theater of the apartheid wars, the liberation wars in South Africa, the so-called what the South Africans call the Bush War. So people sort of emphasized, the war did this and this was the impact. So that sort of brought many of my interests together. And that's ultimately, I think, what led to this, this book.
That's great, and I'm really glad that an Africanist by training end up writing such a sweeping global history, and it shows attention to non-Western histories and alternative frameworks of thinking about environmental change as well, that you discuss as well in the book. So let's move now to the book, and if you can say more about how the book idea itself developed. You've talked about your training and work and field work in South Africa, Namibia, Angola. But how did you start thinking about Indonesia, for example, or North America, or European history? If you can tell us about the research process and your writing experience of Scorched Earth.
Right. So you made an important point just now about, right, being an Africanist and writing about global history, because that is actually a big issue, right? I mean, generally the idea is that to study Africa, right, you use concepts and models and ideas and methodology developed in European history or in Western history, and then see if these dynamics and these models also work in Africa. I come very much from the other side, right? I did do research in the Netherlands on World War II and its impact on society, but my field research in Namibia and Angola actually shaped me very much more, and I started asking very different questions. And also for this, how did I come to this book? So I had done all this research, and I had become aware that this warfare and displacement of people, that was actually a major thing. That people were displaced from their farms, from their homes, to different environments, and then how did they survive in these new environments and even create new villages, new societies, new communities, new workable environment, right, in a zone of refuge in Southern Africa. That was actually my first book, was about how these refugees actually ended up after displacement by colonial warfare, by the slave trade, by internal wars, how they ended up in what was in effect a wilderness, and that my first book was in fact about how did people sort of recreate a livable environment and livable societies, right, in a wilderness after they had been displaced by colonial warfare and the slave trade violence. So my idea was to actually look for a second book at the impact of these liberation wars, right? In the liberation wars in Southern Africa from the 1960s to the 1990s, where northern Namibia and southern Angola, the areas where I'd done my initial field research, were the major war zone. And I had a lot of stories, tragic stories, proud stories sometimes, stories about rebuilding livelihoods, rebuilding family, rebuilding communities, rebuilding environments. And so I did research in other places in Africa too, Mozambique, in South Africa, about this episode, about these liberation wars and what the impact was on people's lives, livelihoods, and environments. And I actually tried to pitch this to a publisher, and the publisher said, well, we're not so interested in Africa as such, right? If you do a global one, then we're more interested. So I started thinking, okay, what can I do? And I decided, well, how do I make this manageable, right? Also, because unfortunately, there's a lot of wars throughout history. So that's, for instance, why I mainly not only use Dutch case studies, where I use primary research, where I used archival materials, because it was easier for me to get access to. That's why you have Indonesia there, because of the Dutch colonization wars in that area. That's why also in Europe you have the Low Countries there. But then when I started, making presentations about the book, people said, well, it's only Africa and the Netherlands. How representative is that for global warfare, right? So that's when I started to look at sort of comparative cases, to get to sort of be able to to use a variety of cases, smaller cases, larger cases, some based on primary research, some based on secondary literature research, to see, well, if you look at a variety of cases of warfare from the 16th to the 20th century, is that pattern repeated, that during war this environmental infrastructure, right? Farms, fields, sources of water, canals, forests, trees, tree cover, etc. Is there a pattern is that in all these different wars across the globe, North, South, Global North, the West, Africa, Asia, is there a pattern there? And my conclusion was in the book, what I wanted to highlight is that there is indeed a pattern from the 16th to the 20th century, that during warfare, this environmental infrastructure, right, this environment shaped by rural communities becomes a major tool of war, but also object and subject of warfare, and thence it being very, very destructive on both society and environment, right?
Yeah, and in addition to your archival research and being from the Netherlands and having access to the Hague's archives and being an Africanist, you also have been teaching global environmental history seminars for a number of years now, and also courses on war and the environment. So would you say that the classroom was also another laboratory for this book?
Oh yes, it was. It was. I had my students read. I used these examples while I was teaching my students. I read and discussed with my students. So that was indeed a laboratory for developing. I mean, my students were also very critical of many aspects, and that was enormously helpful. I had them read many of the chapters. I think in one class, I had it in both a graduate and an undergraduate class. I think in two graduate classes, I had them read drafts of the chapters, and in three of my undergraduate classes, it was really, it's wonderful to be able to have the discussions with with your students, right? And the students also came from all over the place, and from all kind of different, because the students were not only history students, many were history students, especially in the graduate classes, but also from architecture, from ecology, biology, even engineers I had in some of the classes, and that is really enlightening to see how people come from very different backgrounds to assess these, to really make you think about, hey, wait a minute, I hadn't thought about that aspect of it. And you can also see that, right, in sort of you also become aware that if you do it that way, if you look at it globally and discuss this also in a global context, that some continents are much better covered, right? Despite 40, 50 years of trying to break out of this Eurocentrism of history and environmental studies and politics and genocide, that there are still enormous gaps in the literature in terms of sort of the geographical coverage. And that's what the students also brought out, right? The students would say, okay, you're studying this in the Netherlands and in Belgium and in north of France and in Italy, but what about, say, Tibet? Or what about, right? What about Chile? How did that work there? So again, that it's impossible to cover this. This is quite a big book already with 10 chapters, as you said, right? But it's of course. So what this is, it's sort of a tableau also, an impressionist painting that sort of highlights, hey, wait a minute, if you look at this entire large period of almost 500 years, and you look at cases across the globe, you do seem to see a pattern where this environmental infrastructure, right, is what people not only fight in, but also fight about and fight with, right? Because that's also that comes in later. Also, there's also an an economic angle to it, which I maybe have a little bit underplayed in the book, which I now with hindsight I'm realizing that I should have maybe more done with the idea that war actually can pay. Not only that it's costly, I think what I emphasized in the book effectively is that war is very costly in terms of the environmental impact, the costs on nature, the cost on the environment, the cost for human society. But I think I should have highlighted perhaps more sort of also that this means also economic costs, that it's not only costs that are in terms of human trauma and human lives, right? But that are also real sort of economic costs also to the destruction of this environmental infrastructure and the environment itself in terms of sort of the economics of war or the costs of war. I think it is there in the book, but I think I might have stressed that more explicitly.
I think you've done a great job in really telling the environmental dimension of war history that we don't really get to encounter in most of military histories. The environment is just a backdrop to all of these big events, right?
Mm-hmm.
And much has been written about the economy of war and war machines, but not much about nature and how scorched earth, something that has been a trope in literature and poetry and history writing, has been circulating for a very long time, but we don't really understand quite well how the environment is inflected and how it's connected to the experience of war. So for what it's set to do, this book has done a great job. And more about the architecture of the book, you mentioned that the book is divided into chapters, which are organized chronologically and connected thematically. I really enjoyed the connections that you make sometimes between the different chapters and different empires and different environmental infrastructures. You open these chapters with quotes from primary sources, which gives the reader the impression of the sort of archival sources you're dealing with. And you end these chapters with conclusions that foreground the impact of war on both civilian populations and environmental infrastructure. The book is also supplemented with captivating illustrations and very useful maps, which I enjoy in good in history books. Maps are usually not really the focus. Um, and I think that the book and its chapters can be read as standing alone complete narratives and separate chapters, or it can be read as connected geographically, politically, temporally, or thematically, which make the book really a great source for both undergraduate teaching and graduate seminars, as well as an informative starting point to launch a research journey about a given part of the world from the early modern to the modern period. Moving to the sections of the book, so the introduction, envirocide, society, and total war. Uh, in the introduction, what do you mean by envirocide, which is the central concept in this book? And why is it important to re-periodize its history centuries back to historicize it on a global scale rather than tracing it to Europe in the 20th century, as you argue in the introduction?
Well, those are two big questions. So the
Yeah,
first one,
if you
why?
can, yeah, with the envirocide. What do we mean by envirocide?
Yeah, environcide. Why environcide? Why do I use that term? Why a new term, right? Because we have already ecocide and genocide. So why would you, right? In terms of the book is about crimes against humanity, crimes against nature. I think that I'm using this term to highlight, to try to make the argument that the two are actually intimately connected. Right now, they are not. The context of the development of these ideas about genocide and ecocide is the post World War II era, right? Lemkin and the idea of genocide in humanitarian law developed in the late 40s, 1950s. Ecocide is a term from the 60s, from the Vietnam War, right, in response to the use of Agent Orange and other chemical warfare in Vietnam. Um, my argument is that the reason why those two are separated is because they were created, they were thought out, they were produced in the context of a world where we thought that nature and culture were separate, completely separate spheres. And you can see that in many ways. But one example in international law is, for instance, the very sharp distinction between crimes against humanity, which sort of genocide is sort of the crime of crimes against humanity, against human culture, against human ideas and human society. And on the other hand, there's an entirely separate body of law, international law, and that includes environmental crimes. Right, these are seen as entirely separate. That has a lot of consequences. For example, non-Western societies and pre-modern societies are usually seen as being more in nature than in culture. Hence, warfare that damages environment, right, in the context of the non-Western or pre-modern world is usually seen as a war against nature, against natural resources, rather than a war against genocide. This has a lot of implications for today because much of the warfare in the non-Western world, right, takes place in rural areas that are considered to be nature, more nature than culture. Thence, automatically, sort of the laws, the international laws that are seen as applicable to a conflict like that, tend to be more the laws that apply to environmental destruction. Also, of course, environmental destruction in our society is still seen as less critical than actually direct destruction of human property and human lives, right? There is a hierarchy still, right? We're trying to address that with the whole debate about global climate change and what we need to do, but it's still a fact that the two are sort of in a hierarchical relationship, and crimes against humanity are seen as more criminal. So, for instance, there has never been a conviction of environmental destruction during wartime. There is a group of international lawyers, and there are several nations that are actually trying to make wartime environmental destruction a crime, an international crime at the same level as humanitarian crime. But right now, that is not the case. So, in order to sort of break beyond that sort of nature-culture dichotomy, which is exemplified by this very clear separation of humanitarian law, right, with genocide at its apex, and environmental destruction, right, with ecocide as its apex. That's why I'm deploying this idea of environcide, right? That is then aimed at not just nature and not just culture, but actually at the reality on the ground, right? Which is in our 21st century. The fact is that most of this earth, probably all of this earth, is actually co-shaped by humans. So is in fact environmental infrastructure. And in one way or another, humans are both dependent on that environmental infrastructure and the shapers of environmental infrastructure. And this concept environcide, by combining, as it were, by trying to bridge this nature culture gap, this by bridging this gap between genocide and ecocide, it focuses the narrative directly on the fact that actually war actually deploys and employs and uses and takes place in a global environment that is deeply shaped by people, right, and that people are dependent on, and that there is also an awareness actually amongst the belligerents that people are dependent on and shaping that environment, right? that's why it's a main target of war, right? If you apply scorched earth to the enemy, they have nothing to eat, right?
Indeed, and that has been sort of again a trope that we find from classical times to the present, from the Romans and the Greeks all the way to Agent Orange and other chemical weapons used that destroys both human populations and the environment. But in the book, you argue that it's important to trace this history beyond 20th century Europe, which is usually the focus of genocide studies. Why do you think it's the case? Why do we need to retell this history and periodize it to the early modern rather than the 20th century?
That is an excellent question. Why is that important? My main objective was to address with this the whole discussion about the origins of total war. Total war, right, is usually, right, originally in the literature, World War II was seen as the origins of total war, right? Then World War I, right, about 10, 15 years ago, it shifted to World War I. And after that, people started pushing this back to more recent time, the French Revolution, the Napoleonic wars, right, where there was sort of both in practice and in theory that people thought in terms of total war, everything needs to be mobilized for the war. Now, I found, well, as an Africanist, I was a little bit skeptical about the Eurocentric, right? Eurocentric emphasis, because much history is still very Eurocentric. Well, the whole idea about development, right, is very Eurocentric. So I was curious about. I wanted to push that story about the origins of total war, right? As if because there's an economic side, I guess, to it. A developmentalist side to defining total war as a European and modern invention, right? And that is that it's linked to technology and to science and to a certain, I don't know, this seems contradictory, but also to a certain rational scientific mindset. Then, of course, the dark side of it, right? Total destruction. But the total mobilization for war, that somehow it's only modern Western societies that are actually able to mobilize a society totally and rationally to completely gear it towards war, right? That's, I think, how usually total war is seen. So I have first an issue with, well, do you need a modern European technology, science mindset to do that, right? As an Africanist, I have a sort of visceral reaction to that. That's, I think, one. The second one is I think there is an issue with that, right? Because what is usually the focus is the mobilization of resources. But what about the other side of this equation of total war? And that is, it's not only the total mobilization of a society, right, and all the resources. It's also total war. Also means that everything becomes a object, a subject, a tool, a victim, a resource in war, right? So the planning idea, mobilizing resources for war, I think that's a very top-down idea of what is total. It's sort of the viewpoint of the elite. It's the definition of the elite, right? Because then I came across, right, in the Americas, but also in Europe, especially in the 18th century. That's why I have 3 chapters on the 18th century, right? The 18th century is supposed to be, is the age of reason. It's the age of limited war, rational war. People were aware, the elite was aware that the wars were very destructive. You needed to maintain the rural economic base, right? The tax base of your societies. So that's right. That's the reasoning right, for a more scientific, rational way of war that supposedly arose in the 18th century, right? Um, right, but as you can see, that it is the elite that plays a role in this, right? But what I found in these chapters about the 18th century, yes, the elite was talking like that and saying, yeah, we need laws of wars, rules of wars, we need courts, military courts, we have a whole logistical apparatus to fight wars, right, with forts and magazines, stores, etc., right? But that only looked at sort of the planning, the elite, the leadership, the top-down viewpoint of what total war was, right? Because at the bottom, the farmers, what I found especially struck me with doing this research in the 18th century, is actually for the farmers, right? The people in the rural communities in the countryside, nothing actually changed because they were still the people who had to feed the soldiers, right? Who had to supply carts to transport the soldiers, who had to feed the horses, who had to house, shelter, feed, protect the soldiers against the elements. So from that sort of bottom up, right, perspective, these farmers and these villagers, these people in the countryside, and also in the towns, of course, they were totally used, totally mobilized, right? So I think that idea of that total mobilization is the sort of the definition of total war is actually a focus on the top down, right? It's a top down focus, it's an organizational planning focus, and it's a focus that ultimately focuses also on the military rather than on the impact on civilians. And with my book, I wanted to sort of highlight what is the impact of all these military expeditions and campaigns actually on the people on the ground, especially in the rural areas, because the rural areas is where the militaries operated. That's where the battles took place. That's where they camped. That's where they got their food and all their supplies from. And that's where they lived and fought and died. So I wanted to emphasize that side of it. So that's why I wanted to push back this this definition of what was total war, and that's where it's linked sort of to my emphasis on environmental infrastructure, right? Because that environmental infrastructure is the farms, food stores, fields, livestock. That is actually where the rural population depended on, but that is also what these large armies depended on. So I think that's where I try to bring it all together. You know, total war being about control and access to and appropriating the key environmental infrastructure that was shaped by the rural population and that they were dependent on.
And by all of that, your book contributes to global environmental history, genocide studies, and military history by approaching, and I'm quoting you, environmental infrastructure as not only a tool and subject of war, but frequently also an object and a prize of war. Um, the book is divided into 10 chapters, and they are broadly organized in 4 sections. The first section, war, environmental, infrastructure, and envirocide. And we've talked about the concept of envirocide, but how would you define an environmental war? What constitutes it? How can we look at a certain war and call it an envirocide? And basically, how does it undermine and destroy rural livelihood? If you can give us examples from the chapters.
Yeah. So what I try to do is the chapters. Some of the chapters are really focused on really small periods of time and small spaces, Others are much more spatially much wider and look at, they work on a different time scale. Some work on a very micro scale, some work on a macro scale. So let me use some of the macro scales to highlight some of these issues that you brought up. So it's very interesting to see, right? So some of these chapters, including the chapters on the Americas, are actually based on secondary literature. Of my reading, a sort of re-rating of some select secondary literature, right? So, and of course, the literature on the Americas, the conquest of the Americas, environmental change in the Americas, the demographic impact of contact, right, with the European settlers. Settling the Americas and bringing diseases and causing the demographic and also political collapse ultimately of indigenous American societies at large, right? There's an enormous literature on that. So I wanted to include that just to see if I could identify some of the same patterns of environmental war as I saw in other more micro-focused cases, right? So, for instance, Holland, I look at Holland in the 1570s, 1580s, Aceh in the 1870s and 1880s, right? Those are more focused. And in those cases, what I try to do is to see, okay, what are they fighting about, with, right? And if you look at the sort of the Aceh War, you saw that the Dutch military very quickly shifted to sort of a massive scorched earth by burning down the villages all in Aceh, which is in Sumatra in Indonesia. They started burning the villages, and soon thereafter they actually started systematically to destroy also the crops. Both the crops in the fields and the crops that were stored, hidden by the villagers, often in the villages, just before they would abandon the villages when the Dutch military would attack the villages. So that's sort of the dynamic I was looking at. I was seeing, okay, what is this? Do these societies, so the setup of each of my chapters is sort of assess to what extent people have, what is the environmental infrastructure that they have, right? The farms, the fields, what are their lives and livelihoods about, the ways of life, how is that linked to the environment, how is that society, right? That was sort of, and then I would look at, okay, what is the kind of warfare? What is being destroyed? Where are they fighting? What are they fighting about? And what is the impact? Right? So I did that through these case studies, right? Looking at very detailed 10, 20 years and a small province in the Netherlands or in Indonesia, or I have several other ones in the Low Countries and Italy and France and Spain, these cases. So then I try to see, okay, can I see those patterns also in the New World? During the Spanish conquest, the Dutch colonization of the New York, the Hudson Valley, English settlers, French settlers, in Quebec, are they doing similar things? But of course, I was using here the secondary literature, and what struck me immediately is that this nature-culture dichotomy or a similar dichotomy was working in the historiography. So very interesting, so that the histories about the Americas, you can separate them. There is an entirely separate literature on the actual conquest of the Americas by the Spanish, by the Dutch, by the English, by the French, right, by the Portuguese. And it talks about the political and the military conquest and battles and engagement and military. It's very focused on sort of military elements and fighting and actual war. And then there's a separate literature that talks about what I would call the impact of the war, the demographic impact of the war. But it's not linked to the war and the conquest, which is very curious for me as an Africanist, right? Because it's the demographic collapse of the Americas is linked to a biological agency, the unintended importation of smallpox and other European diseases that the indigenous Americans had no resistance to, right? So here you get, as it were, a literature about conquest, military, battles, a separate literature on sort of a demographic impact and the decline of American Indian populations. And then there's a third literature, also completely separate, about the environmental impact of European introduced ideas, technology, science, practices, including capitalism, market economies, guns, horses, sheep, cattle, right? And it is very, very rare to find any literature that tries to link up these three narratives of the impact, right? So what I try to do is actually, I'm trying to sort of highlight that there are actually these connections between the introduction of diseases, that is linked by two, which you can highlight, to displacement of populations from their environmental infrastructure. So even you see that in the American West, where conquering generals like Sherman and Sheridan, who actually use the same environmental tactics in the Civil War, apply these environmental tactics to the conquest of the West, right? The buffalo hunting, horse-mounted Sioux and other Plains Indians, where they often don't even seem to try to capture all the American Indians, indigenous American communities. They attack the villages because, right, they know that when they attack a camp, the American Indians, right, try to flee, but they cannot take all their food supplies, their tents, their horses, right, and all their winter equipment with them, because they don't have the time when they're attacked by a raid by the US cavalry. So they abandon all this environmental infrastructure, all their food supplies, right, dried meat and grains. And that's actually how the West actually was won. It's not the direct confrontation, not the actual battles. It's actually the US cavalry goes after the environmental infrastructure and captures that environmental infrastructure, thence exposing indigenous American groups, right? They're left without food, without horses, without tents, right? In the middle of the winter, because many of the Sheridan and other US generals shifted very quickly to winter campaigns, because they knew if they would rob the Native Americans from all their environmental infrastructure, their tents, their food, exactly, right? They would be exposed to the elements, exposed to famine, thirst, freezing weather, and they would have to perish or give themselves up or flee to Canada, which is exactly what happened. So, right, I thought that was that was actually quite a fascinating part of my journey in writing this book, that I could sort of highlight, hey, wait a minute, what is happening there in the Americas, right? There is also environmental warfare, and very conscious, right? Sheridan and Sherman, their quotes from the literature they wrote themselves, that they actually do this on purpose. They are aware of this, and they on purpose, target that environmental infrastructure, using it as a tool of war.
Indeed. And that's the case that you make in the second section, genocide, ecocide, and envirocide. in which we understand really the relationship between these categories and concepts, and why do we need a new language and framework to capture certain historical experiences, as you examine in the book. The third section, which I find very interesting, personally, perpetrators, victims, and history. And I would like to ask you this. So we know that agency and intentionality are central to both environmental history but also genocide studies. And you've mentioned the intent, the purpose, right there. So, how does your book approach them by complicating how perpetrators and victims are thought of and written in history? How do you suggest we think about agency and intentionality by thinking about war and the environment?
Yeah, I think a context that this is partly directed at is this idea that there are certain societies that, because of their particular path in history, were sort of destined or to become perpetrators of genocide. Right? This is very typical. This is sort of what they call the Germans Sonderweg, the German way of war. Right? That the Germans, because of their experience of colonial warfare in China during the Boxer War, some people have argued, in Namibia, and the Herero and Nama genocide in 1904, 1905, the Maji Maji War in the same period in Tanzania, right? That experience of these very genocidal wars that actually uh, shaped their path towards total war, and that's what actually is what is behind and what causes their genocidal warfare in Europe during World War II. Right, that it's actually a sort of colonial experience with war and conquest that shapes Western history, German history, in this way. Uh, I find that a little bit problematic, right? I mean, I'm Dutch, so we have this strange relationship uh, with our German bigger brother in Europe, right? Because of World War II and the German occupation of the Netherlands. So, from that perspective, you might say, okay, well, if you can link this to particular long, deep histories, right? That is the advantage of that is that you know who it's coming from, right? Who can do these things. So in that German Sonderweg story, right, the Germans have a particular aptitude for it because of their historical experience in the colonies, right? You can say that. But people like Mamdani, right, who wrote this very influential book, very key book on the Rwandan genocide, he actually shows, right, that genocide is not only necessarily committed by the colonizers, but can also be committed by the colonized, right? And he frames this as subaltern genocide, so that genocide not necessarily something that settlers and the colonizers do to the subalterns, to the people they colonized, to their victims, but that actually, in effect, victims of genocide can also become perpetrators of genocide. And I think that is a very, very important uh, point, not only historically, because history highlights these cases, right? I have a few cases, for instance, the Powhatan Indians and the Munsee, right? In their 17th century conflict with respectively the English and Dutch settlers, they seem to have tried, right, to actually exterminate the settlers, right? So that you could say that's a genocide in order to protect them from further encroachments and further warfare, right? by the settlers, right? And the Rwandan genocide, that's Mamdani pointed it out, is very similar because it was actually the Hutu who had been suppressed in the colonial era by the Tutsi, right? And the Tutsi were depicted as sort of the colonizers, the invaders from the outside, the imperialists, right? So, and the Tutsi had indeed also done mass killings of Hutu co-Rwandans, right? But the big genocide in 1991, right, was actually the Hutu, right, the subalterns, as it were, who actually turned genocide on their Tutsi former colonizers, as it were. That's how it was, right? This was a narrative that was created by colonialism, right, and not really reality, because the Hutu and the Tutsi, they speak the same language, right? So is that really a racial difference? But the fact here is that, right, that I think it's very important to highlight that that perpetrating genocide or perpetrating environmenticide, and I think that's what the book also highlights by looking at all these different cases, that is not necessarily linked to being a colonizer, being a settler, being European or being non-European, right? But that that historically it many, depending on the circumstances, the perpetrators can also be victims of a previous round of genocide. And I think that's also important in terms of one of the the more practical contributions that the book wants to make, and that is to say, hey, wait a minute, if you look at history, right, anybody, right, any society, any individuals under certain circumstances can be driven to commit a genocide or environmenticide or ecocide, right? I think that's also where I hint at this. I don't go deep into this, but for instance, right, there is a controversy discussion in American historiography of the West about who actually exterminated the buffalo, right? So in a sort of conventional way, it was seen the buffalo was exterminated by Western settler hunters, right? Buffalo Bill. But then a few historians, including Andrew Eisenberg and others, have argued, well, the indigenous Americans are co-responsible for the extermination of the bison, right? With other words, ecocide. And in my book, I sort of use some of this literature to highlight, wait a minute, right? These many of these Great Plains societies that hunted and contributed to the overhunting of the buffalo, right? These were actually refugees from genocidal and environmental warfare in further east, right? They were displaced, and they were actually communities who tried to survive by hook and crook, by all means possible, in this new Great Plains environment. So they might not have been so benign to the environment, right, as is sometimes portrayed, right? Because they were refugees displaced, sometimes desperate refugees displaced. So in that context, you can wonder, right, did they really have the luxury to sort of, to do a sustainable hunt of the buffalo? They had to survive. Their communities of refugees had to survive. So I think that's also an important argument I try to make by highlighting that this division between perpetrators and victims of genocide, ecocide, and environmenticide is not so black and white as we would sometimes like it to be.
Indeed, and that's a very important intervention that the book makes. And in the fourth section, Environmenticide, Total War, and Resource Wars, we learn more about these connections through the examined case studies, how envirocide complicate really and explicate the way human conflicts and their environmental context are conceptualized around the globe and how that changes over time. Uh, the book covers a vast imperial territory and colonial history that really we cannot summarize in this interview. But I would invite the readers to go exploring the different chapters from the Dutch to the Spanish to the French, the Austrians, and the different also non-European cases in the book. I will just highlight a quote from chapter 7, which is a global way of war in the age of reason, envirocide and genocide in the 18th century America, Africa, and Asia. You wrote that when comparing the ways of war in 18th century Europe with warfare in the Americas, Africa, and Asia, the similarities are as salient as the differences. Uh, I would like you to share perhaps an observation or two about the similarities and differences uh, between these three continents. Uh, how do you think that they represent a global phenomena, but at the same time, we should be attuned to the peculiarities of different local contexts?
This is actually two questions rolled within one. I'm not saying that there are not, right. Every history has its peculiarities and its independence dynamics, as well as being related to larger dynamics, right? But again, one thing where people see the 18th century as sort of very key is that, right, some people say in the 18th century that's where, or 18 from the 18th to the 19th century, that, right, this is not a coincidence. This is where, right, where modern Europe, the modern world, is emerging. So also modern ideas and modern practices and modern, right. So this is also where you have this development of modern war, scientific war, rational war. That's the 18th century, right? And then that morphs somehow, right, into total war, right? That is sort of the conventional narrative, right? And what happens in the non-West is that in the non-West is the argument that modernization of warfare doesn't take the same trajectory. That is, in the non-West, even in colonial contexts, so where Europeans fight warfares, conflicts in colonial contexts, there's a different trajectory to war. And some people claim that there is a continuity, right? So that primitive war, in effect, continues, as it were, right? Whereas in the West, in Western battlefronts, war become modern, more scientific, more technology, right? Limited war in the 18th century, and then flips to total war in at the end of the 19th and early 20th century, depending on where people identify the origins of modern war. In the non-Western context, right, you have primitive war, right, or it's sometimes also called petite guerre, the small war, the guerrilla warfare, right? What's now called, these military terms change from day to day, right? I think we're now asymmetrical warfare is now the term, right? Which is really what they called small war before, right? So anyway, so what you see is a divergence of the ways of war, right? Modern Western war fought on Western battlefields. 18th century, it's limited. 19th century, 20th century, it flips to total war. And then you have the non-Western context, colonial context, where you have actually the small war, which is in a form really of primitive war, right? In effect, if you really look at the literature and how it depicts it. I'm disputing that in my book. I'm saying this separation doesn't, in theory, maybe it takes place, maybe in the military textbooks it takes place. But my argument is that, hey, wait a minute. Yes, there are differences, and and it is shaped by local, colonial, and other conditions, of course. But if you really look at how the ways of war develop, there are actually as many similarities between this so-called Western way of war, this modern war, right, and non-Western small war, guerrilla war, that they actually, if you look at what they actually, right, if you look at what they focus on, what they fight with, and what they fight about, right, you see actually it's a continuation in the sense that it's still environmental war. They still go for the environmental infrastructure, whether it's in the modern West or in, right, in the not only the pre-colonial but also in the colonial context, right? What are these wars about? You see that, and that's what I think I highlight. I mean, we know that for total war, because Scorched Earth is an integral part of modern total war, right? That you can see that in World War One, you can see that in World War Two, right? That's very clear. So what I do in sort of the last section of the book, I focus on non-Western cases, colonial warfare, right? The American West, the conquest of the American West, the conquest of Aceh, Indonesia, and also the conquest of southwestern Africa by the Portuguese and by the South Africans and the Germans, that they actually they keep continuing that same type of environmental warfare, right? There is also a shift, and the shift is that these colonial armies are no longer entirely living off the land, right? But they're still doing Scorched Earth to deny the opponents, to shorten the war by denying their opponents access to food, right? Supplies, shelter, right? With other words, of the environmental infrastructure that not only the military depend on, but also the civilian population depends on. So, right? So there is a shift, but at the same time, I think there is in the sort of the general way of war, there is a continuity in the sense that they still fight with, about, and through this environmental infrastructure, which of course is what the rural population also is dependent on. So in terms of the impact, right, that's why I try also with the, right, especially in the case studies, right, what I've tried to do is to highlight not only the practices of the warfarers, so the soldiers, but especially the experience of the people exposed to the warfare, so the farmers and villagers, and how they experience the impact of war and the destruction or capturing, stealing, plundering, pillages, or their displacement from their key environmental infrastructure. How do they experience that? What is the impact, right? And which you then see that there is this constant, since warfare, right, throughout this period is scorched earth that focuses on capturing or pillaging or destroying or displacing population and the opponent from this key environmental infrastructure, right? That remains constant throughout this period. So that is not something that is new, right? But the context can be different, right? I mean, the environmental context is different. So, for instance, if you look at this, the colonial warfare in Southern Africa. In Southern Africa, the invaders, the Portuguese and the British South Africans, they wanted to fight in the dry season because they wanted to evade malaria and horse sickness that affected their military capability. in the American West, right, in the plains, the U.S. Army preferred to do its campaigns in the winter, because in the winter the American Indians, the Plains Indians, with their mobile villages and their horses, were the least mobile, right? During the winter, the American Native Americans of the plains, they were totally living off the food supplies they had obtained during the summer and the spring hunts. And these food supplies were in their villages, in their tents, right? And so if they could destroy the tents, capture the tents, right, and the food supplies, they were actually undermining critically, they were defeating the American Indians. So there you see, right, there are differences and historical peculiarities. But the overall, right, the way of war remained throughout this 16th to the 20th century. It remained capturing and using as a tool and as a price of war the environmental infrastructure that rural populations and urban populations ultimately also, of course, entirely dependent on.
Indeed, I don't think anyone after reading your book will ever be able to overlook the environmental cost of warfare and how it's really embedded in throughout history in violence and human experiences of domination. And I really enjoy the fact that you give examples from both European imperial powers, but also from examples such as the Asante Kingdom, and the other examples you've given of non-European forces that are shaping warfare history. Uh, well, we've taken a lot of your time, Emmanuel, and I would like to continue talking about the different chapters, which really I can't do them justice in this interview. And I really recommend the listeners to pick up the book and really enjoy the narrative flow, which really reads well as just a good history, and learn about the different parts of the world and how they've experienced warfare and the environmental costs of warfare from the bottom up, not just told from the perpetrators alone. Uh, as a final question, what are you working on now? If you have any current projects or things that you are hoping to work on, I'm not expecting you to be working during these difficult times, but if you would like to share any of your current or future projects.
Well, I'm now working. I'm about halfway with a project that takes this story up after World War II, right? Because again, World War One and World War II, everybody knows and understands that this was highly destructive. I don't need to, and there was genocide, and people have been prosecuted for genocide at the Nuremberg trials and other places, right? That this was a criminal war. These were criminal wars. But interesting enough, people have not looked that much. Well, an exception is maybe the Vietnam War with Agent Orange, because that's actually what generated the idea and the concept of genocide, of ecocide, I should say, right? But again, that is seen as a war against nature rather than at people. So what I'm doing now is a look at insurgency and counterinsurgency warfare post World War II, and how they were also marked by environmental ways of war. And so there, I'm actually making the argument that that despite the fact that post World War II we have the development of international human rights law and also increasingly international environmental laws, but that despite this development of environmental international laws and international human rights, that this has not, oddly enough or sadly enough, changed the face of war in the non-West, especially in the global South, especially during the the Cold War. And of course, this is not just global South wars, right? And then a responsibility and an agency, a perpetratorship by non-Western global South governments, because this is during the Cold War. Many of these wars in the global South were actually they were called proxy wars. I don't think that's totally right, because there were many local dynamics explaining these wars too. But nevertheless, they took place in the context of the Cold War, the East-West confrontation, right? But in the global South, the Cold War was actually far from cold. It was very hot, actually. And so what I'm doing is I'm looking at several conflicts in the global South during the Cold War. And I'm tracing there also the sort of what is this again sort of does this environmental warfare actually continue? And actually I'm finding that they actually intensified and are less about living on the land, but more about denying resources to an enemy, right? These are all have aspects of liberation wars, unconventional wars, guerrilla wars, insurgency wars, in which there is this idea that how do you combat an insurgency? This is after Mao, right? Mao said guerrillas have to be like the fish in the water, right? The fish in the ocean. The ocean feeds and shelters and is the element in which the war takes place. So the Western counterinsurgency model, or the colonial counterinsurgency model, was not to remove the fish. Its model was to remove the waters, to drain the ocean, right? And so that is sort of the metaphor, but I think in many ways it's also the reality of many of these insurgency and counterinsurgency wars. So I'm going to look at the Dutch, the decolonization war against the Dutch attempt to recolonize the Indonesia in the late 1940s. The French Indochina War, the French Algerian War, the Nigerian Civil War in the 70s, and the wars in Southern Africa, the liberation wars in Southern Africa, in Namibia, South Africa, Angola, and Mozambique, to sort of see if I can find that genealogy and that pattern of warfare on a global scale in the Cold War, in post-World War, in the post-World War II world, to identify to what extent this international human rights law and international development have actually identified this environmental warfare, and if they have responded to it. And my conclusion at this moment is that that international human rights law and international environmental law and international development have entirely failed to acknowledge the impact of this kind of warfare in the global South, with disastrous impact. And I think this played a big role in the underdevelopment of the global South in the post-World War era that has not been acknowledged. So I hope to highlight that in this new book.
That sounds like a very much needed sequel for Scorched Earth, and we will be looking forward to it. Thank you so much for your time and for sharing your thoughts and your book with us today. And thank you for the listeners for listening to today's episode, in which we explored Scorched Earth, Environmental Warfare as a Crime Against Humanity and Nature, published by Princeton University Press in 2021. This is your host, Ahmed Al-Mazmi. Stay tuned for the next episode of New Books in Environmental Studies.